Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Ian Duncan-Smith's resignation has been simmering for some time, but it was triggered by plans to make cuts to disability benefits outlined in the Osborne budget. But what were they? A few days before George Osborne's budget, the government previewed plans to change the way claimants were assessed for certain disability benefits, saving £1.3 billion a year. The Office of Budgetary Responsibility said the changes to the Personal Independence Payments, or PIPs, would adversely affect around 370,000 people by 2020. The amount of PIP a person receives is decided by awarding points based on need. The government proposed reducing the number of points awarded for the use of aids and appliances such as grab rails and specialist toilet seats, arguing people would already have these items. Ian Duncan-Smith resigned, saying the changes were not defensible in a budget which was reducing taxes such as income and capital gains tax on the better off. Replying to the resignation, the Prime Minister said it had now been agreed not to proceed with the policies in their current form. But that wasn't the only major criticism levelled at George Osborne's budget. The Chancellor confirmed he'll miss 2 of his 3 fiscal rules. Next financial year, welfare will cost almost £120 billion, well over the cap of £115 billion, which he introduced himself to restrict overall welfare spending. And he also broke his debt rule, which promised that national debt would decline every year as a proportion of national income. This financial year, total debt is expected to be 83.7% of GDP, up from 83.3% in 2014-15. Well, we did ask the government for an interview about the disability changes and IDS's resignation, but we were told no one was available. It's a familiar refrain these days, especially when the government is in trouble. But I'm joined now by the head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Paul Johnson. Welcome to the programme. Now, the government, it looks like it's U-turning on these cuts to disability payments. How big a hole does that blow in the Chancellor's efforts to get a budget surplus by 2020?
Well, the truth is that we're talking about very small numbers here in the context of £800 billion a year or so of spending. The Chancellor's aiming for a nearly £11 billion surplus. If he doesn't get any of these savings, then it takes him down to just under 10. So in that sense, it doesn't matter all that much to his target for 2020.
But he's already inked in £3.5 billion of unspecified cuts. We don't know what they will be to get to surplus. There's about 8 or 9 billion of what some may call jiggery-pokery as you move about business tax revenues, cuts to public investment in the final year, and now this. I mean, it must make it more difficult for him.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things in the budget which are clearly aimed specifically at getting to surplus in that very particular year, 2019-20. As you say, numbers are being moved around quite a lot, and there are some unspecified spending cuts in there. It is important, though, to see this in the broader context. Unless something awful happens, we will get close to a budget balance in 2019-20, which, given that we were at over 150 billion of deficit in 2010, the biggest deficit in peacetime that we've had, to get from there to actually close to surplus will be quite an achievement. And politically, I understand this matters enormously, but economically, the difference between a 10 billion deficit and a 10 billion surplus is almost neither here nor there.
Ian Duncan-Smith says that, all right, they may be U-turning on the 1.3 billion of cuts on disability payments, but that 1.3 billion cut will still be in the DWP budget. The Treasury would expect that department to find 1.3 billion elsewhere. Is that right?
Not necessarily. I mean, this isn't like the health budget or the education budget. This is a so-called annually managed expenditure budget, which is determined by the demands on the budget. So I think if they don't put these changes to the personal independence payment in, then the presumption at least will be that spending will still be in the DWP budget.
The day after the budget, you said the Chancellor had only a 50-50 chance of hitting his surplus in 2020. After this retreat on disability, would you like to recalibrate these odds?
No, I think, you know, as I say, this is a relatively small change in the context of where we are. It's still a 50-50 shot, and importantly, the thing that will determine it is much less changes of this kind and vastly more what happens to the economy, whether the economy does better or worse than currently expected. And don't forget, actually, in many ways, the most important thing that we learnt on Wednesday is that the government has got, and the OBR has got, much less optimistic about the economy, and therefore we'll all be worse off than we thought we were going to be.
But the Treasury, as Ian Duncan-Smith has been saying, has been clawing away at working age welfare benefits for years. For him, this was the sort of final straw. But isn't that inevitable? If you have a government that ring-fences pensions and ring-fences the NHS, the only other really big triple-figure spending line is welfare.
Yeah, if you're looking to, as the government has been looking to, really dramatically reduce the deficit significantly through cuts in spending, you're not going to be able to avoid doing things on the welfare side. As you say, much more than £100 billion we spend on just working age welfare, which is or covered by that welfare cap, which is far more than we spend on almost anything else apart from the health service and pensions.
But the Chancellor's created this fiscal position. I mean, he found himself in a far weaker fiscal position than even just last November. But even though it was weaker, he cut business rates, he cut corporation tax, he cut capital gains tax, he raised the personal allowance, and he raised the 40p income tax threshold. He didn't have to do any of that. And even if he'd done only some of that, he would not have had to look for these cuts in disability. He has made this himself.
No, you're right, he didn't have to make any of those changes, though it's worth remembering it was very clearly in the Conservative manifesto to increase the personal allowance and increase the point at which you pay higher rate tax. So presuming that he would kept the manifesto changes, he would have had to have done that and has to do quite a lot more down that route. But cutting those taxes clearly meant that he had to do some other things to maintain
Which
his
he didn't
target.
have to do.
He didn't have to, no.
And also, perhaps his leadership pretensions did play a part. There were two major areas where he could have raised a lot of money. Pension reform, by taking away the top tax relief, would save billions, and he could have raised the fuel duty. I mean, if you don't raise it now, when would you ever raise it, given what's happened to petrol prices? Both could have raised billions. He chose not to do it.
Well, those are two very different kinds of things. So taking the petrol tax first, yes, you're right. I mean, it is astonishing, actually, that with petrol prices at their lowest level for a very long time, duty on petrol at its lowest level since the mid-1990s, the cost of driving a car at its lowest level probably for 30 years.
And yet he still didn't do it.
If you can't increase fuel duties, even in line with inflation then, that's a long-term problem for the Treasury, because this brings in a lot of money, £30 billion a year, and if that goes, that's a real problem. On pension tax relief, I think it's a much more complex issue, and there are good economic arguments for maintaining a system rather like we have at the moment, and clearly had you got rid of that 40% relief, you would have hit the 5 million or so people who pay 40% tax, and that would have been another group of the population rather unhappy.
Just one final question. The national debt, according to the OBR, the debt, not the deficit, will be 1.74 trillion by 2020. Now, if the government was then to run a surplus of, say, 10 billion a year for 10 years, which would be unprecedented in British government, after a decade, the debt would still, by my simple arithmetic calculation, be 1.64 trillion pounds. Is that what you mean by economically irrelevant in running a surplus?
So the key point about the size of the debt is its size as a fraction of national income.
That's more important than the absolute level.
That's more important than the absolute level, because clearly as the economy grows, then the absolute level you can maintain is bigger. Now, even running a surplus of 10 billion or so a year, you don't get to pre-recession levels of debt until the mid-2030s. And I think the argument the Chancellor would make for running a surplus year after year is that if you even just run a balanced budget, which again is something we haven't done very often in the past, that takes you through into the 2040s and 2050s. So even with a continued surplus, it takes quite a long time just to undo, as it were, the damage that the crisis did.
Paul Johnson, thank you for being with us.